Hello, everybody. I'm Felix Wemheuer from the University of Cologne, and this is my YouTube channel studying Maoist China. And today I have a distinguished guest, is Professor Chen Yixin. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, hello. I'm very glad that you are here today. We have a long history of collaboration because we both are very interested in the famine. And the reason why we talk today is this book that came out recently with Cornell University Press, When Food Became Scarce, How Chinese Peasants Survived the Great Leap Forward Famine. And Ishin is a professor for history at the University of North Carolina. And I'm also very glad to hear that his book will be published in Chinese in Hong Kong by a Chinese University Press of Hong Kong um, next year. The first time we collaborated was for this book. It came out in 2011, Eating Bitterness, how new perspective on Chinese Great Leap Forward and the famine. And Yixin made a contribution, a chapter for this book. And yeah, let's start to talk about your new book. So the first question I like to raise to you is, could you please explain how your own experience as Sandown used during the Cultural Revolution is related to this research, and also in which way did the villages change from the Cultural Revolution until the period when you did your oral history interviews for your book?
Thank you very much, Felix, for your nice introduction. And we did work together for a long time. Um, so, to answer your question, how my own life experience as a sent-down youth to the Chinese countryside shaped my academic interest. I would say in this, I during the Cultural Revolution, I was sent down to a village that was called Old Chu or Lao Chu in between 1970 to and 1975. I stayed in that village for more than 5 years. So that village was very poor in Mao's time, and when I first became interested in doing the work on the Great Leap before the famine, starting interviewing peasants. Of course, the first village I want to go was Lao Chu because I knew everybody was there. And the question in my mind was try to understand really how miserable the peasants' life was. And I had my own life experienced this kind of miserable time, but I never had a kind of a systematic understanding of it. So I remember when I first started my research interest, uh, I recall the life when I first got to the countryside in Laochi. When we came from the cities, with the four of my classmates, five of us made a small group as sent down youth to 知识青年 to that Laochi village. And we very quickly discovered that the village did not have big trees. Then we asked the peasants, this kind of image totally contradicts to what we normally imagine a Chinese village that exists for several hundred years to 1,000 years. And you would expect to see huge trees cover the villages. That was a kind of very typical image. But when we get there, we asked the peasants, then the peasants told us all the big trees were gone. And during the famine, we had to eat tree barks, and we have to peel off all the tree barks. And the tree barks had two layers, the inside and the outside. And the out layers could not be eaten because it's too hot. Then you have to peel off the bark from the outer layers and then leave the inner layers and let it dry up, and then hammer them into kind of the powder and cook into a sort of a soup, or I can say porridge with a rice bran. It's very difficult to swallow, but it could support your life. Then that made us to realize the life was very difficult. I heard a lot of stories about the terrible things, the deaths of their family members, of the peasants. And that was a time in 1970 to 75. Peasants still had a very fresh memories about what happened in 1959 to 1960 in the famine. So when I first tried to interview the peasants, what in my mind was to try to understand why, how miserable the life was, and why it was the case. Then after I visited the villages, did my interview in the year of 2000, I visited Laochi for 4 days, and then I realized if I want to understand systematically the miserable life and the causes of it, the better way was to understand how the peasants survived the famine. Because during the famine, basically everyone died in the same way due to the lack of the food. They did not have enough to eat. They starved to death. But then you realize every survivors who basically made it through the different strategies, and they had they stole food from a granary, and they had some kind. They ran away, and they begged food. They have some kind of their own individual strategies, and sometimes they had a collective resistance. That made me to realize we should try to study from a survivor perspective to better understand how famine really caused the deaths, and why majority of people actually survived, lived on with a life. So I think this answers the first part of your question. And so the second part of your question was about how the villagers, when I visited in 2000 and the later years, were different from the Cultural Revolution. Well, when I lived in the villages for 4 days, it was very striking differences. It was very apparent to me. The peasants began to use electricity. When I was there was no electricity. The electricity was equipped in 1989 for the village of Laochi and the entire area. Electricity, of course, would help peasants with the illumination, but what most importantly, it provides kind of energies that it can use in agricultural production. Because the central Anhui, where Laochi is located, was kind of hilly, and all the landscape was like a terrace, so was not very flat. The main crops they grow are the rice. The rice require water. So in traditional time, they have to use the people's manual labor to pump water. And now with the electricity, they could put the electrical pump there, pump water. That's basically liberate them from a very difficult physical work. So that's one thing I saw, electricity. And the second thing with the drinking water. When I was there, I hated the drinking water. The entire village had one well. The well needed to be in the low spot of the entire landscape. It was outside the village. People had to go there with the two buckets with a shoulder pull and carry water from outside the village to the inside of their residence. So that was about 150 meters. It was very difficult, particularly in the raining days. To carry 2 heavy buckets of water was difficult. And then in the late 1980s to the early 1990s, the entire village hired well digging teams. And those professional teams basically dug a well for every household. And every household now had a well in their backyard. And that make the drinking water much cleaner because they could put a cover on the well, and also it's much convenient to get water. So this really improved their living standards. And the village lived largely, nobody had ever lived to 70 years old, and perhaps except 2 women. But with much healthy drinking water, and I think they now could expect a bit of longer life expectancy. And think another thing, the third thing I see the change was the life became much easier, relaxed for the peasants. Life during the Cultural Revolution, during Mao's time, you plant everything in spring and had a field management, particularly for the rice in summer, and you harvest in autumn. And then you have to go to a various kind of water conservancy project in wintertime. So for all year round, you just have to work every day. And people, the peasants told me before the communists took over, they had at least had 1 winter as a slack season in which they did not have to work. Now, with the decollectivization in the middle 1980s, the land was given back to the peasants. They had their own autonomy to manage the agricultural affairs about what they want to plant and when they're going to plant. So they had incentive to work. The work became much more efficient than the Cultural Revolution period. Then they did not have to go anywhere for the water conservancy project. That makes them life much easier. So they, in the wintertime, they have a lot of leisure time for them. And also, even in summer, where the time I wanted to do interview, they still had a lot of leisure time because the management of rice paddies was not so difficult. So life became a little bit easier, and also because they had enough to eat. Because in the 1980s, what I learned, the unit output of the rice, wheat significantly increased because the new seed varieties and widely use of chemical fertilizers. The peasants worried about the quality of their soil going to become bad because the massive use of chemical fertilizer. But on the other hand, that improved their unit output, probably by they doubled or even more than doubled the output. So in that way, they had enough to eat. So that was probably another thing as observed. And one more last thing, the village became kind of so-called Halloween. The young people left, only the older people were left in the village. When I went there in the year 2000, and the young people went to Shanghai, Guangdong, and Xinjiang, do various kind of jobs. And the villages did not have anyone at the age between 16 and 40.
Yeah, that's very common. Yeah.
Yes.
I
Yeah, I would say basically, you can say compare the difference. Life, living standard improved. Life became easier, but they still had quite a bit of problem. They're still very poor. The poverty was there, and the architecture that been their houses was still old style, that is the house they built, the thatched cottages they built in 1960s and 70s. But when I went there again around 2008, 2009, they all changed.
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
overwhelmingly changed to the brick houses.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah,
please.
yeah. I think also some other scholars on the
Uh,
of the famine use their experiences and connections from the time as Sandown news and to study the famine. For example, Gao Wangling, right?
yeah.
And for example, Ralph Sexton and also Gao Wangling, they all emphasized in their research the importance of peasant survival strategies. You already mentioned some, like underreporting, stealing, organizing black markets, and so on. But their narratives were focused on peasant resistance versus the state, right? It's a kind of duality between peasants and the state. In your book, you argue that rural lineage and family connections played a crucial role to understand why some people could survive and others would starve to death. And as we know, Anhui was had the highest death rates among the Chinese provinces, one of the highest death rates. So can you explain your argument in more detail? Who had to starve and who would survive and who would decide that?
Okay. I think both Gawani and Sexton made an important
Mm,
contribution to the study of the Chinese Great Leap of Famine. I think the most important contribution was to make us to understand that the peasants were not the passive victims. They did not just stay at home, wait the death before to them. However, I think their argument had two flaws. One flaw was they over politicized their argument. They would view the peasants' resistance as a political action against the state, or they interpret it that way. But I want to say the peasants' resistance was essentially a resistance against the food policies of the communist government. Even Mao Zedong himself used the term.
mm,
500 million of peasants had a tenacious
mm,
resistance, but not a resistance against the communist state. Instead, it was resistance against food policies. They refused to give up the green to the communist government. So that I would think of the one reason the interpretation failed to explain some kind of resistance activities. And another flaw was that they both did not recognize the famine lasted for 3.5 years. It was a long process. And many of those individual resistance did not work very well. And if you have stealing food involved in black market activities, that it would allow some people to survive, no question about that. I also mentioned those things, but the main thing is when you think about it, it's a long process. And for the difficult moment, for instance, from late 1959 to summer 1960, many villages for this 7 to 9 months simply did not have food, and you have no place to steal food. So that limits the practice of individual resistance. And when they talk about underreporting of grain production, that here I think that they did not make a distinction between individual resistance and the collective resistance, because they report less about what you actually harvest. That was the action of the entire production team, not the individuals. So when you get to the entire production team,
mm,
that were the collective activities. Then you have to study what culture, what social mechanism enabled this kind of a collective resistance, not individual resistance. Individual resistance can spontaneously from individuals who were starving, who simply want to survive, who want to grab everything they could eat. But underreporting required plan,
Yeah.
required leadership, right?
Yeah,
So
but far as I understand, so their
yeah.
argument was that collective resistance is more the peasants' right versus the state,
Mm.
while the difference to your argument is that you argue that actually the strong families in one village, they had the resources to protect their own people, where were kind of families who were kind of small or weakly connected, they would have more dead people amok then. Is this correct or?
Yes, it's
Mm.
correct. You captured my argument very well. So the logic of my argument was that the lineage was not something the communist government liked. Communist government want destroyed as a feudal system. But in 1955 to 58, the communist government to promote collectivization and then later on the mess hall or the people's dining hall, then they forced the entire village to live together. The entire village was collectivized. They had to pay tax as one entity, not like before 1955. Each peasant would pay agriculture tax to the state. When they were forced to live as one collective body, and particularly when they always deprive their rights to cook at home, they have to eat in the public dining hall. Then the food became a collective issue. The everyday meals became a collective issue. When they had a food shortage, the local cadres, the village cadres, who were normally the emerging leaders of the lineage, need to find out the way to supply food for their peasants. And then very quickly, some village leaders realized that's the best way because they live collectively were to retain a part of the food secretly. And you're going to conceal the food some places and for themselves to prevent the state from collecting all of them. Then once you have these kind of collective actions, then it leads to the question, so what kind of a social mechanism, what culture behind this kind of collective actions? So as I said, individual actions can be spontaneous, but collective actions, you must have a leadership and you must have an organization structure, and that can the lineage. That lineage had been in the villages for 100 years or even 1,000 years, and communist government was only in the power for 10 years. They could not destroy everything, particularly the communist government forced them to relive together. And then they have to behave collectively. And when they try to fight famine, it was actually policy caused the famine. So they became resist against the state policies. Then they have to use their traditional organizations against the state enforcement in food collection.
Yeah, and so some people they compared countries or provinces, and in your book you also compare
Mm.
several village. For example, the relation between lineage structure and the death rate. So what were actually also explain what explains difference between the villages you went?
Well, I visited villages, first in Anhui, and later I tried to use examples from Jiangxi. For about 40 villages we visited, it became obvious when you saw enough villages, you can come up with some kind of a conclusion. So southern Anhui was mostly the mountains. It was a part of the southern China mountains, connect with the Jiangxi and the Fujian and Zhejiang provinces. In those mountains, people live in village was small and in terms of size. The villages are built in the valleys. So the communication with the outside world was difficult. So the villagers maintained their traditional lineage They have a very, very close organization. They have very strong regulations, which they often reinforce. So there's a lot of racial performance. So the identity for this lineage was very strong. Plus, they live in southern China mountains. They have wide vegetations. So wild vegetations help them a lot in the time of the food shortage, and also almost virtually every village in the mountain areas or conceal some food for themselves. They can easily put in the forest or jungles, and the communist cadres from the local government or from people's coming had no way to discover them. And then in northern Anhui, it was part of a North China plan. The villages were normally large because the landscape, people had a much better spatial mobilities. They could move around. So in traditional societies, the poor peasants could find alternative jobs to be hired out, to engage in sideline industry or in commerce as the ways of survival. However, so that left the lineage not very closely organized, because people could always engage in some activities. They were not always in villages. The regulation could hardly reinforce on them. Plus, that kind of a tradition that many villages simply have no formal activities of lineage. They share the lineage identity. They knew what's their surname, but they did not have all kinds of ritual performance, ancestor worships, because they move around a lot. That was the basic patterns of their life. So when the Great Leap Forward came in, when the famine occurred, those villages, they were traditionally poor compared to villages in southern Anhui. They could not find alternative food for themselves. They have no way to hide food because they live in plant. That's physically, once you get there to see that kind of plant, you will understand there's no place we could hide. There's one case I used in the book for the North China plan with the village, the entire lineage. They had a good organization, and then they decided to dig an underground tunnel to hide food. Unlike the villages in the mountains, they could simply put the rice, newly harvested rice, in the forest. Nobody could find them. Only they themselves knew whether they're hiding. But in North China Plain, the entire village had to take action. Everyone had to maintain that secret. They knew that the grain was hiding underground. In the underground tunnel, they were constructed. So in the end, that entire village, nobody died compared to their neighboring villages. 50% of the people died of starvation. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I ask you, so when food became scarce, how would they then distribute the food inside the lineage? I would also guess maybe that old people and children were more likely to die, or maybe also women.
I would think that's a very good question. When you read the famine literature, it was most of the case older people and the children and the people with chronic illness would have died first. That was the case in southern Anhui. In the mountains, people, when they faced the food shortage, the villagers would go to the nearby mountains to find the food. That require the physical strength to walk to the mountains in about 1 mile or half mile to 1 mile. And I think the most important thing was the dig those wide vegetations with bigger roots that could provide a starch. That was a hard manual work. So the little children and also the older people did not have that kind of physical strength to go there and particularly to dig out the roots. So if you read the book, you can find the southern anguish I discussed. Every village I went, people told me, okay, we have about 7 or 8 people died of starvation in our entire village of 400 people. And it turned out all of those deaths occurred to old aged people or young children, 2 or 3 years old. And women died first. I think it's an interesting question. In the traditional society, women probably suffer from a gender bias. The food was going to be saved for the male population in the house. But in the Great Leap Forward, it was different because family did not have control of food. And everybody was eating in the public dining hall. The mess hall provided food to everyone at the same quota. When the quota was very low, for instance, only several ounces a day, then the people just eat the same amount, men and women. So there was no cultural bias against women on the mess hall system. And the women, of course, they had to save food for the children, but when they were too hungry, it's very difficult to do. And in one chapter I mentioned, but that was not in my that was in my Chinese edition of my book. In one village, when the food was a food supply in 1959 was cut to 3 liang per day, like 150 grams per day. That's impossible to support people to survive. Then the husband and the wife decide they were not going to eat together because they were afraid they're going to eat each other's food. So you can see women did not die because of the cultural bias or because of food supply or anything. So that was not a cultural phenomenon in the culture in a Great Leap of Famine.
Yeah. Like later in the people's communes, right? Women would get less work points, Gongfen, than
That's right.
men, right? In the later period. So in the last part of your book,
Mm,
you compare provinces. You compare Anhui and
mm,
Jiangxi, yeah, and it's
mm,
quite remarkable that the difference in death rates
mm.
were very high. So what is your explanation that death rates in Jiangxi were much lower than in Anhui?
Well, when I first read the death rate, I was very surprised to discover, according to the population historian Cao Shuji's
Mm.
estimation, Anhui's deaths were about more than 6.3 million people. That was over 18% of the entire population. And in Jiangxi, the province just neighboring to Anhui, suffered deaths only 180,000. About just at 1%, a little bit less than 1% is the population. So the difference was more than 17 times. That's it's going to be a very striking difference to everybody. So in my book, I did the research. That's why I went to Jiangxi. I visited 4 villages in Jiangxi. I wrote about 2 of them, and to see whether their behavior, the peasant behavior during the famine, was any great different from the peasants in Anhui. Then, after study in Jiangxi, I found that Jiangxi villages, the only difference was that they were more built on a single lineage basis. But that make no difference because the peasants did not behave anything differently from the peasants in Anhui. So then the question is going to be raised to the provincial level. So if in the villages at the grassroots level, people did not behave differently. So then the question is, how could the peasants in Jiangxi have more food than the peasants in Anhui? And that must have something to do with the efficiency to enforce the Great Leap Forward policies and the collection of agriculture tax. So when I studied at a provincial level, I basically discovered three things. First, Jiangxi had a much better agriculture conditions. Their land size was larger than Anhui, but their population was smaller than Anhui. Then on per capita basis, Jiangxi people had more land to fall back if they need more to produce more grain. And Jiangxi's physical condition was also much better than Anhui. That means the peasants did not need to go to the large water conservancy projects, unlike the Anhui, where sometimes the entire half of the rural population was rural laborers were in a water conservancy project for the irrigation, for other things. So in this way, peasants in Jiangxi could devote them to agriculture production. And then you can see very clearly during the famine years, the agriculture production did not decline very much, only a little. They had enough food. That made Jiangxi to be the second most important province to provide food for the entire country throughout the entire 3 years of a famine. But in Anhui, they did not have this kind of condition. And the labor forces left the villages for various kind of engineering projects, and they did not harvest as they usually did. So the agriculture production in Anhui declined by 20 to 30% during the famine years. So that means they did not have enough food. So that's one reason, the difference in agriculture condition. And the second was actually the policy advantage, because China in 1958, right before the Great Leap Forward, decided the newly reclaimed land did not need to pay tax for 3 years. So 3 years to be exemption. Because Jiangxi had so much land, then the Jiangxi government decided to develop the so-called state-owned farms. Then the state-owned farms, starting from 1958 to 1959, produced about close to 16% of the grain for the entire province. But those 16% of the grain did not need to be submitted to the state because they got a tax exemption. So Anhui did not have that kind of condition. Jiangxi had like more than 300 state-owned farms. The Anhui only had 20. They did not produce very much. So when famine occurred, then the Jiangxi government had food at their disposal. They could redistribute food as a relief, famine relief, to villagers. That was approved by, that was confirmed by the villagers that I interviewed. And in 1959, 1960, they often got food supply from the state. This kind of thing never occurred in Anhui. Yeah. It never occurred because the Anhui government did not have food in their hand for their disposal. Then I think the last factor explained the great difference between those two provinces was the provincial leadership.
Yeah, very infamous, right? The Anhui provincial leader, Zheng Xisheng.
Zheng Xisheng was a radical leader. He wanted to achieve things. And he was not the Anhui native. He did not have strong ties with the local and the grassroots cadres. So he just tried to enforce his policy. And what surprised me was that he had been in the Anhui for 10 years. He knew very little about the Anhui. And during the famine, he did not visit the countryside, the rural villages. But Jiangxi had a kind of cooperative leadership, and they were loyal to Mao Zedong, but they were not so radical. They tried to stay away from a most radical program. So when famine occurred, they will mostly visit the entire Jiangxi rural area, villages, because they had been the Red Army soldiers during the Jiangxi revolutionary time, and their life was saved by Jiangxi peasants. They had a very strong ties with the local peasants. When they heard the story, the peasants suffer from famine, and they could easily redistribute some food to those peasants, to those communes, because they had the food at their disposal. But Anhui, the local cadres were very much afraid of Chen Yixin, who had a temper, and then who was such a radical, almost to the extent of extreme. So it was very difficult to not to follow Zheng Xishan's policy. That I think the enforcement of a policy in a ruthless way was a major reason why so many Anhui peasants died.
Yeah, yeah, I did my PhD on the famine in Henan, right? There was a leader, Wu Zhipu, also a very
Uh,
radical leader, and a lot of
uh,
grain was then exported to the other provinces. So, thank you very much for this discussion. And I'm happy there's a new book out on the Great Leap Forward. I think
okay.
the Cultural Revolution, right? One new book every year almost, but for a long time, we had no monograph on a Great Leap Famine, and it's I think
Mhm.
equally
Yeah.
important than the
Mm.
Cultural Revolution. So I'm very glad also that there will be a Chinese version next year. So thank you and goodbye.
All right. Thank you very much, Felix. Good to see you.
Bye.
Bye bye.